Okay, well thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today we're going to talk about GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. For those of you that don't know about this regulation, it is a European Union regulation. It goes into effect in May of 2018, so it's we're quickly approaching that deadline for GDPR. So today I'm going to talk about the implications of GDPR, because there are implications here in North America. It's not just in the European Union. We'll talk about what some of the solutions are that we have from CA Technologies. I don't want to make it an advertisement for CA products, but we want to make sure that you understand the technologies that we have available to help you be compliant with GDPR. So with that, I'll go ahead and start the presentation. First of all, what is GDPR? And the difference between a directive and a regulation is important to point out. A directive was what they established back in 2012, which is basically a set of guidelines for companies to follow within a country. They then let the countries determine the enforcement of that regulation, okay, or that particular directive. So it was a legislative act, and then what we see happening in 2018 is that directive has turned into a regulation. So there's enforcement and there's penalties associated with that particular regulation. And so I just wanted to make sure that you understood the difference between a directive and a regulation. So GDPR brings into law the original Data Protection Directive, which was back in 2012. And it's basically a single set of rules that apply across to all of the EU. Now, why are we talking about it here in North America? It's because the General Data Protection Regulation reaches over to any company that is managing citizens' data from the EU. So if you're an international, multinational company, and you have a database that is managing user information, personal information, of EU citizens, then this law applies to you. So it doesn't matter what company you are, even if you're based here in North America, if you're managing EU citizens' data on a database, you are subject to this particular regulation. And so we just want to point out that the rules apply to EU member states. It also applies here. Now you may be asking, how will they enforce that here in North America? They are working with the US government here to provide enforcement of this particular regulation. So if you're familiar with other compliance regulations, HIPAA, for example, or GLBA, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Banking Act, these are regulations that are here in North America, and there's different bodies that enforce those particular regulations. PCI, for example, you've probably heard of PCI. PCI is enforced by the banks in particular. This particular regulation, GDPR, will be enforced by government entities here in North America. Either that or they will adopt a similar regulation to GDPR. And so either way, companies will be subject to this particular regulation regardless of where they reside. What are the primary objectives of GDPR? Well, the first one is data rights of citizens' data, okay? So data subjects' rights and a harmonization of the particular regulations. Those are really the two goals for GDPR. And so what they're trying to do is give citizens back control of how their data is used by various companies, and where that data is stored, and the right to know where that data is stored. And so if you go and look at the regulation, there's a lot of legalese and a lot of information in there, but it basically talks a lot about giving rights back to end users or customers to manage and have a say in how their data is managed and consumed and used, especially as it pertains to testing. And that's what we're talking about here, as it pertains to testing. So the main elements of GDPR is that it's applicable across the European Union and globally. Again, there'll be that reach across here to North America. It'll strengthen user data protection and ease business compliance concerns. That's the goal of the regulation. It's effective in May of 2018, and a lot of companies have a lot of work to do still to be compliant. So if you're working towards being compliant, that is what is expected of you as a company. So a lot of companies will say, well, we're not going to be compliant by May of 2018. That's okay. You have to have things in process to be working towards becoming compliant in 2018. To do nothing is not a good idea, okay? It's better to have some things in process so that you can state, if you're ever involved in a situation where they question compliance around GDPR, you can show them, well, we're doing this and this and this. We're taking steps to become more compliant. So there's a range of new requirements. Protecting data security is core to compliance. There's an expanded definition of what is personal data. So it's not just user ID and password anymore. It's expanded to be race and religion and all of these other things that are part of a person's identity information can be considered personal information, okay, or personal data. And then of course there's the fines of up to 20 million euros or 4% of revenues associated with those infractions. So personally what I think will happen is this law will go into effect. The EU will find a company that is not in compliance and make an example of them, okay? And it'll be in the news, it'll make the news and so on. And so companies will see that the EU is serious about enforcement of this particular regulation. That's how I think that's going to unfold. So it's best to have a plan in place. If you have no process in place yet, you really need to be thinking and starting now to put a plan in place to address GDPR. If you're a compliance officer, you're in the right place. If you're a tester, you need to be talking to your compliance officers. If you're in DevOps, you need to be talking to your compliance officers about GDPR. Make sure that you're starting to get ready for it. There was a survey recently done about 6 or 8 months ago. 200 customers were queried as to the areas of importance and how GDPR would impact those particular areas. Notice that in a lot of areas here, 93%, 90%, the way we consume personal data is going to be impacted, the way we manage data, use of personal data, how we process personal data. 200 companies all said, we have a concern about how we're going to manage data, user data, going forward. And so it just kind of highlights the importance of this particular regulation and that we need to pay close attention to it. What are the particular calls to action around GDPR? Well, there's new requirements. So there's data protection by design or default, okay? Data protection impact assessments and data protection officers. These are all things that large companies will have to take a look at. So data protection by design, you're now going to have to start to have plans on how you're going to manage and protect end user data. From a testing standpoint, are you copying large amounts of data and do you have control of where that data is going? If not, then you have a concern there you need to really address, okay? Data protection impact assessments, this is where you'll have to do some reporting on how compliant you are. There may be, the EU may send a request to you to demonstrate how compliant you are. And then data protection officers, there may be an increase at larger companies where they're going to have to add some additional people to address GDPR in particular. Compliance in general, but GDPR in particular. Okay? With new rights and science to users, okay, there's certificates and seals or codes of conduct. So there'll be certifications for companies, or you'll have a stamp of approval that you're GDPR certified. Those things are coming in the near future. Data breach notification. This idea that you have 48 hours to let somebody know if their data has been breached is also part of the regulation. And then this one is interesting, the right to be forgotten. So if an end user contacts you and says, I don't want to be a part of your testing, I don't want my name used in testing, I don't care if you hide my name, I don't care if you mask it, I want to be removed from it, You have to comply, you have to respond to their request and remove their information from your testing, which means removing information from any of the databases that are not particular to just the production database for them, okay? So this is a tough one because a lot of companies will say, well, I don't know where everybody's data is. You know, that may be a problem if you don't know where their data is, being able to identify what data is stored where, and then being able to remove that so you can comply with this particular request. Okay, so again, companies will need to understand where data is stored and be able to collect it and know who has access to it. And then a strong role for identity as well, strong and transparent identity policies and tools. Some companies are going to have to look at stronger identity access, privileged access management capabilities, and so on, associated with data protection. So all of these areas will impact you in terms of GDPR compliance. In my opinion, it is a more far-reaching or broader type of compliance initiative than others that we've seen in the past. And so companies may have to add additional tools or additional manpower to be able to address some of these situations that come up. So what are some of those issues that you'll need to address? I mentioned earlier this right to be forgotten. Okay, so customers can write in, they can say, remove my personal information. You'll have to respond to that. Data protection by design. You might have to implement specific technical measures to ensure that solutions protect privacy by design. Okay, so it's not an afterthought, it's privacy by design where you're taking the customer into perspective first, not as an afterthought. A lot of companies are just like, oh yeah, test data, we copy test data, and they don't think too much about it until a breach occurs and somebody gets access to even the test data that you've copied for, for testing purposes. Breach notification, again, responding within 72 hours. Some of the regulations say 48 hours, 72 hours for this one to the affected individuals. And then having to do data protection impact assessments. If you're familiar with PCI compliance, for example, in banking, depending on the size of the company, you have to demonstrate compliance. You have to send in written documentation. If you're a larger company that does X number of transactions, then maybe you have to have an auditor come in and demonstrate compliance and so on. GDPR is similar, but it depends on the size of the company to the extent that you have to demonstrate compliance. So just be mindful of some of those issues that you need to address. So from a testing perspective, what are the challenges for testers? Testers and companies have to have consent to use personal data, okay? So that kind of changes things a little bit. You have to have consent to use personal data. So you need to know where data exactly where sensitive data resides, and you have to understand specific approaches to generating GDPR compliance as it pertains to testing. So again, some challenges there. Where's the data located of these end users? And could I quickly remove it if I had to? And can I document that? So that's a challenge for a lot of companies without the right tools. This changing definition of consent is a big one. So it used to be companies could say, well, or that person, they checked the box, or we automatically checked the box, and so they agreed to certain terms. All right, GDPR kind of tightens up that concept of consent, saying that, that's not good enough. We're not going to let you check a box for me, or if I don't respond to you, that doesn't mean that I agreed that you could use my data. Okay, so this definition of consent is changing. Pre-tick boxes or inactivity cannot be used, silence cannot be used. Blanket consent for all future use of data will also not be possible. Okay, so just some things to keep in mind. The less customer data you have spread out across your environment for testing, the better off you're going to be. So as a precaution, or as a first step, is to really understand where that data resides, who has access to it, what kind of data is out there, and exposed. to various testing organizations. That really is the first step. So I want to talk a little bit about Test Data Manager, okay? And this is a CA product. A couple of years ago, we acquired Grid Tools, and we acquired Test Data Manager from Grid Tools. This product has the capability to identify data, to generate data, and also to fill in the gaps where data might be missing for your particular testing environment. So it's a very, very powerful tool. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about Test Data Manager, and also invite you to go over to the demo pods 306 and check out what I'm talking about. So after the session here, I encourage you to go over there and take a look at it. So the first thing that Test Data Manager does is discovers personal data across your organization, and you can protect it from unauthorized access. We are working right now on a feature for profiling of your test data. So what that means is, in the next release of Test Data Manager, you can actually scan your network and see where the personal information is for those end users. That's one application of Test Data Manager. One application of profiling is specifically for GDPR, but it could be used for anything. You could be searching on data for any particular concern or test that you want to do. We'll find that data, and you can then choose, you can reserve that data for use in testing. But the big deal about it right now is, for GDPR, you can view personal information, and then you can tag that, whether that information is safe or not safe for your particular testing purposes. So again, we have a demo of that over here at 306. Just tell them, hey, I want to see the GDPR profiling demo, and they'll show you what I'm talking about there. All right, a couple other things. Make sensitive information to meet GDPR pseudo-anonymization rules, but understand the limitations of masking. So GDPR specifies that if you're going to use test data, okay, you need to mask that data, which means hide it. Basically take a list of the data. If it's social security numbers, if it's phone numbers, actual users, and so on, you have to change all of that. You have to hide it and change it so that it's non-identifiable for testing purposes, okay? So GDPR says, look, if you're doing that, that will meet the minimum level of compliance. So Test Data Manager has the capability to do data masking, okay, subsetting and masking of the data. And so that is one option that you can use to meet compliance regulations such as GDPR. You can also manage and optimize the use of data in your software lifecycle. Consider implementing what we call synthetic data generation. Again, they can show you what we mean by synthetic data generation, but it's basically generating data from scratch, fake data. So a lot of companies are saying, you know what, I would rather build data from scratch and not have to worry about any actual user information if I can avoid it, right? Now that's easier said than done at a lot of companies because they have a process in place where they're using production data, they mask it, they're using it in testing and so on. And so we offer synthetic data creation, the ability to create fake data and build that data quickly, millions of rows of data, and not touch production data. And so that's another option that you can use instead of just trying to mask your original production data. Again, we can show you how that works. What we think is a best approach is a hybrid approach. So maybe you are already doing masking. Maybe you already have a test data management tool. Maybe you're using a homegrown application that does test data management. We come across a lot of companies that are, have some sort of solution, but they don't have the capability to generate synthetic data. And so this adds a new element of helping you with GDPR, helping you with compliance in general, so that you can build out these the test data without using actual production data. So again, masking helps. It's highly complex. some information is often left as a form of compromise. So by that I mean there's inter-column relationships within data, there's dependencies and so on. When you mask data, you kind of have to leave some of that in there. And so masking it's an approach that works, but sometimes it's left open to some vulnerabilities where if you have a certain amount of information, such as where the city, the name of the person, the city, maybe a zip code, it's almost like a hacker can piece together, oh, I know who that user is, or they can piece together actual user data. So masking is an approach that's been around for a long time. We provide the capability to do it, but there is some downside to it, okay? So you just need to be aware of that. Also, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the definition of personal information is growing, okay? So related to genetic, economic, social identities, and so on, I think a lot of times the courts are going to have to determine, well, what is personal information and what isn't. All I can tell you is that definition is expanding. So again, another reason to use synthetic data is to simply avoid the situation with personal data or anything that could be identified as personal data, okay? And then, can the mass data be reverse engineered using a single piece of external info? All right, there have been situations where companies have been hacked and their test servers have been hacked and they've actually been able to get data out of there and cause user breaches and so on of actual user data. So it's a dangerous thing. It's best to try to come up with a better strategy. And the way that I look at GDPR is it's an opportunity to improve your test data management practice while you become compliant with yet another regulation, okay? So a lot of times companies will say, oh, another regulation. But GDPR is actually an opportunity for you to improve your test data management practice. And if you have the right tools, then you're going to be well on your way to demonstrating compliance around GDPR. And again, you don't have to be completely 100% compliant in May of 2018. You have to be on the trail or on the path to be demonstrating compliance. So GDPR has a wide ranging of implications of data in non-production environments. Again, we provide PII-free testing capability through synthetic data generation. We can show you that over here, how we generate synthetic data. We have seed lists of users, last names, first names, phone numbers, and so on. You can combine all of those seed lists and generate millions of rows of data in a matter of minutes so that you have synthetic data that is not anywhere associated with PII. And so that's a very good thing. Okay, and then profiling, as I mentioned, identifies that sensitive information so we can actually tell you where your sensitive data resides, and then you can decide whether it's safe to keep using it or not. You can tag that data. So again, some very powerful capabilities with Test Data Manager. I mentioned synthetic data generation. I won't read all of the context here. Bottom line is you can build fake data in huge amounts, and you can do it very quickly. We recommend this hybrid approach. So a lot of companies aren't going to simply abandon masking right away. What they're going to do is they're going to move towards a synthetic data creation approach. Probably some new applications that they're developing, they'll start to use synthetic data generation for those new apps. And then as they move along, and eventually they'll move over to the legacy applications that they're testing as well. It's a process. We recognize that. You're not going to flip on a switch overnight, especially if you're a large company, but it is a process that you can begin and eventually over time move over to completely synthetic data generation. We can also provide authorized data access. So with our product, we centralize data security. So we have LDAP support, Active Directory support. So if you want to create, you have users obviously in LDAP or Active Directory. We support those security mechanisms so you can authenticate through Active Directory and LDAP into Test Data Manager. So we provide that security that you need to function in a more secure environment when you're managing test data. And lastly, this is just kind of a slide. Most companies, they'll have production data. They'll do some kind of copying and masking of it, turn it into non-production data. But a better approach is the synthetic data approach, where we don't use any production data at all. And then there's some key functionality here that you can also read. I won't read all the details there. But bottom line is that GDPR is a regulation that is more broad and far-reaching than we've seen with other regulations that are out there. It will impact North America, okay? Again, if you have EU citizens' data on your databases, you will be impacted by this regulation. And this regulation will reach across the ocean and touch you, okay? So you want to be prepared for it. May 2018. And again, Test Data Manager is a great option to help you on your journey to being GDPR compliant.